Inside Pelican Bay. 2002 Pelican Bay SHU hunger strike. Silence behind the concrete. The fog rolled in heavy over Crescent City in the winter of 2002, swallowing the coastline in gray mist before seeping into the cold concrete walls of Pelican Bay State Prison. From the outside, the facility looked like a fortress, a brutalist monument to control. It had been built in the late 1980s to house California's most dangerous inmates, men whose names echoed in indictments and on police blotters from Los Angeles to Oakland, from San Diego to the Central Valley. Inside, however, the most feared part of the prison wasn't the yard or the cell blocks, or even the gangs that ran much of daily life. It was the SHU. The security housing unit was Pelican Bay's beating heart and darkest chamber. Designed as a prison within a prison, the SHU was a collection of windowless pods where inmates spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Each cell measured about 8 by 10 feet, concrete walls, a stainless steel sink and toilet, a bunk and little else. No direct sunlight. No view of the outside world. Just fluorescent lighting, a steel door with a slot for food trays, and silence that pressed against the ears like a physical weight. For the men locked in these cells, the SHU wasn't just punishment. It was erasure. Guards called it the end of the line. Inmates called it the hole. To psychologists who later studied the environment, it was something worse. A machine designed to dismantle the human mind. By 2002, many of the inmates held in Pelican Bay's SHU weren't there for disciplinary violations. They hadn't stabbed a rival in the yard or attacked a guard. Instead, they were there because of gang validation. California prison officials used a controversial system to identify suspected gang members. Tattoos, names and address books, hand signs, even artwork or letters could be deemed evidence of affiliation. Once validated, men were locked in the SHU indefinitely with no clear release date. For some, that meant decades of isolation. The logic was simple. Remove the shot callers from general population, cut off communication, and the gangs outside would weaken. But the reality was far messier. The SHU became a place where inmates languished, stripped of programs, education, or even meaningful human contact. Mental health deteriorated. Hallucinations, paranoia, self-mutilation. These weren't exceptions but symptoms of prolonged isolation. Families complained that their loved ones became unrecognizable after years in the SHU. Lawsuits piled up, alleging cruel and unusual punishment. The prison fought them, insisting the conditions were necessary for security. Inside, however, the inmates felt a different truth. They were being buried alive. It was against this backdrop that whispers of resistance began to stir. No one remembers exactly who first proposed it. Some say it was a Mexican mafia associate tired of seeing his friends go mad. Others point to members of the Black Guerrilla family, who had long viewed Pelican Bay as a symbol of racial oppression. Still others argue it came from a loose alliance, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, independence, all united by a single, desperate idea. If the system wouldn't listen, they would stop eating. A hunger strike. The tactic wasn't new. Prisoners across the world had used starvation as a weapon, from Irish Republicans in the Maze prison to civil rights activists in the United States. But inside Pelican Bay, a hunger strike carried unique weight. Food was one of the few consistencies in SHU life. 3 trays a day shoved through the slot. Bland, institutional, but predictable. To reject those trays was to reject the last thread tethering you to routine. And to do it collectively, dozens of men in unison, was to transform silence into resistance. In late January 2002, the first refusals began. Guards delivering breakfast trays noticed inmates sliding them back untouched. At first, it was just a handful of cells. Then more. By the end of the week, 60 men had joined the strike. Their demands were stark but simple. An end to indefinite SHU confinement. Fair reviews for gang validation. Basic human rights. Phone calls, visits, educational programs. Medical attention for those suffering the psychological toll of isolation. To the outside world, these might have sounded like modest requests. Inside Pelican Bay, they were revolutionary. Prison administrators reacted with a mix of skepticism and hostility. Warden Joseph McGrath, who had taken over Pelican Bay in the late 1990s, publicly dismissed the strike as a ploy by gang leaders. "These are dangerous men," he told reporters. "They're manipulating the system for their own purposes." But behind closed doors, staff felt unease. They'd seen hunger strikes before, but never in the SHU on this scale. Guards watched as trays piled up outside doors, untouched. Medical staff began daily rounds, checking blood pressure, heart rates, weight loss. Some inmates held out defiantly, refusing even the protein shakes offered as supplements. Days stretched into weeks. The smell of uneaten food soured the air. Bodies weakened. Yet the message grew stronger. To understand why the hunger strike mattered, you have to understand the psychological warfare of the SHU. 4 years, prison officials had used what was known as the debriefing process. The only official way out of the SHU was to debrief, meaning to provide information about gang activity. In essence, to become an informant. For many inmates, this was a death sentence. Snitches were targeted, not just inside prison walls but outside, with families often placed in danger. It created a cycle: stay silent and face indefinite isolation, or talk and face violent retribution. For many, it was no choice at all. The hunger strike was a way to break that cycle, not by informing, not by violence, but by collective refusal. Outside the prison, families of SHU inmates began to hear about the strike through letters and legal calls. Word spread to activist networks in San Francisco, Oakland, and Los Angeles. Organizations like California Prison Focus and legal aid groups began documenting the protest, publishing newsletters and contacting journalists. For years, the SHU had been invisible to the public. Out of sight, out of mind. Now stories began leaking out. Men held in windowless cells for 10, 15, even 20 years. Mental breakdowns ignored. Medical needs dismissed. Mothers and wives traveling hundreds of miles for visits, only to sit behind glass for 15 minutes. The hunger strike gave those stories a spotlight. But inside Pelican Bay, retaliation followed. Guards threatened strikers with disciplinary write-ups, which could extend their SHU terms. Some reported cell extractions, teams of officers in riot gear dragging weakened men from their bunks for medical evaluations. Others described lights left on 24 hours a day, or cold air blasted through vents as punishment. The strike wasn't just against hunger. It was against the system's attempt to erase it. Still, the men held on. By mid-February, the strike had gained momentum far beyond Pelican Bay. Newspapers like the San Francisco Chronicle picked up the story. Editorials questioned whether California was crossing the line into cruel and unusual punishment. Human rights organizations began comparing the SHU to torture chambers in other countries. State legislators, pressured by advocates, demanded answers. Hearings were proposed. Oversight committees were dispatched. For the first time in years, Pelican Bay's SHU wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was front-page news. The hunger strike didn't achieve all of its demands. Many men were pressured into resuming eating after weeks of deteriorating health. Medical staff warned of organ failure. Families begged loved ones not to die inside concrete boxes. Eventually, the strike wound down. But it left a mark. It showed that even in the most controlled, silenced environment imaginable, resistance was possible. It forced California to reckon, however briefly, with the human cost of solitary confinement. And it laid the groundwork for future, larger hunger strikes, in 2011 and 2013, that would involve thousands of inmates across the state. The 2002 strike was a spark. And in Pelican Bay, sparks had a way of igniting wildfires. Escalation in the shadows. The first week of the hunger strike was a test of endurance. By the second, it had become a test of willpower. Pelican Bay's security housing unit was not designed for resistance. It was designed for submission. Every wall, every rule, every silence imposed upon the men in isolation was meant to remind them of their helplessness. Yet, in the winter of 2002, 60 men turned that silence into defiance. They weren't eating. They weren't bargaining. They weren't backing down. The prison strikes back. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, couldn't afford to show weakness. Administrators feared that giving in to SHU inmates would send a dangerous message, that the state's most feared convicts could dictate policy from behind bars. So the counterattack began. Guards increased cell searches, tossing what little personal property the men had onto the cold concrete floors. Radios, letters, family photos, all scattered and sometimes confiscated. Those still refusing food were written up for gang activity, the very label that had landed them in the SHU to begin with. The irony was bitter. Protest hunger strike equals proof of gang control. Proof of gang control equals more time in solitary. To the administration, it was a closed loop. To the prisoners, it was entrapment. Medical staff monitored the strikers closely, documenting weight loss, dehydration, and fainting spells. Some inmates reported being force-fed nutritional shakes against their will, strapped into chairs as tubes were inserted. The message was clear: you may starve, but we will decide how you die. Whispers through the walls. The SHU was supposed to keep inmates isolated from one another, but human beings always find ways to communicate. Tapping on walls, shouting through vents, notes smuggled in laundry bags. Even in silence, networks formed. Through these underground channels, the hunger strike was organized and maintained. Men who had once been enemies, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, now found themselves united against a common oppressor. One inmate later wrote in a smuggled letter, "In here, the enemy is not across the cell block. The enemy is the system that keeps us buried." That unity was unprecedented. California's prison system had long relied on racial divides to keep order. Now, at least for a time, those divisions blurred under the pressure of shared suffering. Families at the gate. While the strike raged inside, word began to leak out beyond Pelican Bay's razor wire. Letters written in trembling hands reached families across California. Wives, mothers, and children learned that their loved ones were refusing to eat. Some hadn't heard their voices in years, only reading the fragments of themselves preserved in ink. A woman named Maria, whose brother had been in the SHU for over a decade, became one of the first to sound the alarm. She contacted California Prison Focus, a grassroots organization already documenting abuses at Pelican Bay. Soon, phone calls were made, press releases drafted, and sympathetic journalists tipped off. By February 2002, the strike had reached the pages of the San Francisco Chronicle. Editorials raised difficult questions. Was solitary confinement rehabilitation, or was it psychological torture? Could California justify keeping men locked in cells indefinitely without meaningful review? For the first time, the SHU wasn't invisible. The public spotlight. The media attention put CDCR on the defensive. Officials painted the hunger strike as a gang-orchestrated stunt. They claimed inmates were manipulating sympathetic outsiders, weaponizing public opinion to dismantle security measures. But cracks in the narrative began to show. Independent medical reports confirmed the deteriorating condition of the strikers. Families testified about their loved ones' mental decline. Human rights groups began comparing Pelican Bay to notorious prisons abroad. One damning comparison came from Amnesty International, which had already criticized California for excessive use of isolation. The 2002 hunger strike gave their words weight. A superpower was now being compared to authoritarian regimes for its prison practices. Fractures in the protest. Inside the SHU, unity was fragile. Not everyone was willing, or able, to endure the hunger strike indefinitely. After 2 weeks, some inmates began eating again, their bodies pushed to the brink. Others were persuaded, through promises or threats, to abandon the cause. But the core remained. The men most committed to resistance held on, their ribs pressing against their skin, their vision blurring. For them, this wasn't about short-term gains. It was about proving that even in the most dehumanizing environment, they still had agency. The administration tried to exploit the cracks. Informants were promised leniency if they named the ringleaders. Some were pulled into debriefing sessions, told that the only path out of the SHU was betrayal. But still, the strike endured. Political pressure. By March 2002, pressure had reached Sacramento. Legislators on the Public Safety Committee received letters, petitions, and even personal visits from activists demanding oversight. Some lawmakers dismissed the strikers as violent gang leaders unworthy of sympathy. But others, especially those aligned with prison reform, began calling for hearings. The CDCR scrambled. They issued carefully worded statements emphasizing security and order, while quietly acknowledging that policy reviews were underway. Inside Pelican Bay, the men heard these whispers through the grapevine. Hope flickered in cells that had known nothing but despair. For the first time in years, it seemed the world was watching. Breaking point. After nearly a month, the hunger strike began to falter. Bodies couldn't endure the deprivation forever. Medical staff warned of permanent organ damage, irreversible neurological effects, even death. Families begged their loved ones to stop, fearing they would lose them entirely. Slowly, men began to eat again. Some wept as they took their first bites, feeling both relief and shame. Others swore they would rather die than give in, only to collapse days later, their protests forced to an end by failing health. By April, the strike had effectively ended. On the surface, CDCR declared victory. The prison had not caved to demands. The SHU remained intact. Gang validation policies continued. And the hunger strikers returned to their cells, weaker than before. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. Seeds of the future. Though the 2002 hunger strike failed to win immediate concessions, it planted seeds that would bloom years later. Activists had new stories to tell, new evidence of abuse to present in court. Families who once suffered in silence found each other, building networks that would grow into statewide coalitions. Most importantly, the men inside Pelican Bay realized that collective resistance was possible. Even in isolation, even across racial lines, they could unite. And when the next hunger strike came, nearly a decade later, it wouldn't be 60 men. It would be thousands across the entire state of California. The 2002 strike was over. But its legacy was just beginning. The aftermath of empty trays. When the last hunger striker at Pelican Bay lifted a spoon to his lips in the spring of 2002, it was not victory he tasted. It was survival. The hunger strike had ended without clear concessions. The security housing unit remained unchanged. Men were still locked in windowless cells, confined 23 hours a day, denied programs, and condemned to indefinite solitary on the basis of gang validation. To the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation (CDCR), the message was simple: the state had weathered the storm. But to the men who had refused food for weeks, and to the families and activists who had amplified their voices, the strike was far from meaningless. It was the first crack in the wall of silence that had long surrounded Pelican Bay. Bodies weakened, voices strengthened. In the weeks following the strike, many of the men suffered the physical consequences of prolonged starvation. Dramatic weight loss, dizziness, organ stress. These lingered long after food was reintroduced. Some strikers reported that their eyesight never fully returned to normal, while others experienced lasting digestive damage. Yet there was another effect, less visible but far more powerful. Their stories began to circulate beyond the prison walls. Letters smuggled out during the strike were published in newsletters by California Prison Focus and distributed among advocacy networks. These letters described the SHU in vivid detail: the concrete boxes, the silence that broke men's minds, the absence of hope. For many Californians, it was their first direct glimpse into a world that had always been hidden. One line, written in shaky script by an anonymous striker, became a rallying cry among activists. They can take our food, but they can't take our will to resist. Families take the fight outside. The hunger strike galvanized families who had long suffered in silence. Mothers who had once driven 8 hours north to visit loved ones for 15 minutes behind glass began meeting with other families. Wives and children wrote letters not just to their imprisoned relatives but to legislators, journalists, and church leaders. Maria, the sister who had first alerted California Prison Focus, later said, "We were ashamed before. We thought no one would listen. But after the strike, we realized we weren't alone. We had each other, and together we could be louder than the walls of that prison." These family networks grew into the beginnings of California Families Against Solitary Confinement, a movement that would later play a central role in challenging SHU policies statewide. Legal battles begin. Even as CDCR dismissed the strike as a gang ploy, lawyers saw opportunity. The protest provided testimony, documentation, and a platform for lawsuits alleging cruel and unusual punishment. Attorneys argued that prolonged solitary confinement violated the Eighth Amendment. They pointed to evidence of psychological damage, paranoia, hallucinations, suicides. They highlighted the debriefing policy, which forced inmates to inform or face indefinite SHU time, as inherently coercive and dangerous. While early lawsuits in the 2000s often failed, dismissed on grounds of security necessity, the hunger strike's visibility planted seeds for stronger cases to come. By the next decade, these seeds would grow into landmark litigation that forced California to drastically reduce SHU confinement. The prison's counter-narrative. Inside CDCR headquarters, officials framed the hunger strike as proof of gang coordination. In memos later released through public records requests, administrators wrote that the protest showed the reach of prison gangs and their ability to manipulate public opinion. This narrative served two purposes: it justified maintaining harsh SHU policies, and it undermined the legitimacy of the strikers' demands. But cracks appeared in the state's armor. Internal reports showed that many SHU inmates were not active gang leaders but men accused on flimsy evidence: tattoos, old letters, even artwork misinterpreted as symbols. The hunger strike had exposed this, and public scrutiny made it harder to ignore. A blueprint for the future. Although the 2002 strike ended quietly, it became a blueprint for resistance. The men inside learned critical lessons. Coordination was possible even in isolation through tapping, shouting, and smuggled notes. Unity across racial lines, Latino, Black, White, was not only possible but necessary for survival. Outside support mattered. Without families, activists, and media coverage, the strike would have been invisible. These lessons would prove invaluable a decade later, when Pelican Bay became the epicenter of mass hunger strikes in 2011 and 2013, involving thousands of inmates across California. Those later strikes captured international attention and forced major reforms, including the 2015 Ashker v. Brown settlement, which sharply limited long-term solitary confinement in California prisons. And it all traced back to 60 men in 2002 who decided to push their trays back and say no. Human costs and personal consequences. Not all strikers survived the aftermath unscathed. Some were punished with extended SHU terms, despite already facing indefinite isolation. Others lost what little privileges they had: radios, visits, correspondence. A few were transferred to other maximum security facilities, further cut off from family. But the deepest scars were internal. One former striker later wrote, "When you stop eating, you learn how much of you is body and how much is mind. The body breaks first. The mind tries to hold on. But in that cell, even your thoughts feel like they belong to someone else." For many, the strike was the first and last time they felt part of something larger than themselves. Once it ended, they returned to silence. A legacy of resistance. Looking back, historians of California's prison system view the 2002 Pelican Bay hunger strike as a turning point. It did not dismantle the SHU. It did not win immediate reform. But it changed the narrative. It turned the invisible into the visible. It reframed solitary confinement from a necessary security measure into a moral and political issue. It forged connections between prisoners, families, activists, and lawyers that would grow stronger with time. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that even in the most oppressive environment, where light and sound and time itself were stripped away, resistance was still possible. Epilogue. In the years that followed, Pelican Bay remained one of the most feared prisons in the United States. Its SHU continued to swallow men whole. But the 2002 hunger strike haunted its halls. Every tray that clattered through a slot carried the memory of the time when dozens of men pushed theirs back. Every guard walking the tier remembered the moment when silence turned into defiance. And every activist who gathered at the prison gates carried the knowledge that change, slow, brutal, costly change, had already begun. The 2002 hunger strike was not a victory in the traditional sense. But it was a warning. A sign that the SHU, no matter how secure, was not unbreakable. Years later, when thousands of inmates across California refused food in unison, shaking the state to its core, they did so on the foundation laid in 2002. The men who starved in silence had lit a fire. And that fire would burn until the world could no longer look away.